Double Rainboom is a really cool fan project created by Flamingo Rich Productions. Assembling a huge staff of animators, voice actors, sound designers, etc., and directed by Zach Rich, Double Rainboom was an animation project that Zach did for his college finals and spent over a year in production. He billed it as the first fan-made full-length episode to feature show-quality animation, and indeed, as an animation test, the episode is quite impressive. However, what interested me the most while watching the episode is that the animation doesn't actually look like the show. I mean, yes, all of the poses and facial expressions are pretty much lifted straight from the show, but the way they're actually animated is quite different. The two big differences between the look of Double Rainboom and the look of the show are the frame rate and the smoothness of the animation. It's actually hard for me to say if Double Rainboom has a lower frames per second count than the show, but it wouldn't be surprising. After all, this is a completely non-profit project, and adding in more frames would ordinarily be a matter of increased time and budget. There probably weren't as many people doing in-between animations on this episode as there would be on an ep of MLP, wherein the studio can probably send the episode to some studio in Korea or something to produce extra in-betweens. More importantly though, what makes the style different is the lack of bounce in the characters. In MLP proper, there's a lot of bouncing in all of the animation, as well as a lot more instances where the animation goes between extreme positions very quickly. In Double Rainboom, a lot of movements don't feel as fluid as they would in the show because they're actually given too many frames. This is kind of hard for me to explain because I'm not actually an animation student, and I suspect that Zach Rich himself could even explain this better than I can. But basically, to make animation look natural, there has to be a certain speed and fluidity to it. For instance, let's say we were animating a walk cycle. In order to make the walking feel natural, we can't just have every frame of the hoof's movement evenly spaced apart, because when you walk, or more prominently here, skip, not every part of the movement takes an equal amount of time. If this is hard to understand, or if you really want to learn more about how animation works in MLP, I definitely recommend checking out Grant Budet's MLP animation analysis videos. Not only does he go super in-depth on analyzing movements from Pinky's walk cycle in the Smile Song to the way that speech is animated in the show, he also shows you how to do it all yourself. If you watch these videos for yourself and then watch Double Rainboom, then you'll probably start to see what I'm seeing here. I don't imagine that this artistic difference was unnoticed by Zach Rich. More likely, the scale of the project and the fact that it was a completely non-profit fan work means that certain things were just allowed to slide. There are a lot of moments in Double Rainboom that feel more like the show than others, so it's kind of a case-by-case thing with the moments that do or don't reflect the show. What this caused for me overall was a sort of uncanny valley effect. The uncanny valley refers to the fact that the closer something gets to looking real, the more obvious its unreal traits become. In the case of Double Rainboom, the uncanny valley is both in the subtle animation differences and in the voice acting, which obviously isn't the original voice actresses. Now, I've seen a ton of MLP fan animations which look and sound nothing like the show, but it doesn't feel jarring because those are their own things. It's only because Double Rainboom comes so close to actually looking like MLP that the differences become really unnerving, which is a kind of sad way to prove just how good Flamingo Rich did in nearly capturing the show's style. But before I'm done talking about the animation, let's move on to the point where it actually gets interesting. Midway through Double Rainboom, Rainbow Dash is teleported to the city of Townsville from the Powerpuff Girls. This part of the show is very interesting because it doesn't look like the original Powerpuff Girls, but definitely looks like what Powerpuff Girls would look like if it were made today. Because Powerpuff Girls had been cell animated back in the day, it didn't have the consistent outlines and character models that the Double Rainboom version has. It kinda looks like if you combined the thick outline style of PPG with the clean stylistic backgrounds and models of Foster's Home for Imaginary Friend. An appropriate combination since Lauren Faust worked on both shows. The coolest thing about this section is that even though Rainbow Dash is drawn in a different style, all of her movements are still taken directly from MLP. Now, instead of looking strange because they aren't quite the same as the show, the movements become fascinating because they've been reimagined in this new style. So that about wraps up my thoughts on the animation, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't also talk about the cultural impact and reception that this episode has had among the fans of MLP. There was a pretty interesting paradigm shift here in which expectation and result came to an impasse and, hold on, something's happening. This is, what?
Double Rainboom has been touted since its reveal as the first fan-made episode, and while Snowdrop may have beaten it to release by a week, Double Rainboom still beats it out in terms of overall runtime. Not that any of this is a competition. Anyways, it's actually rather unfortunate that Zach and co have been using the fan-made episode catchphrase so strongly, since, ironically enough, that's probably why there's been such a large portion of detractors for this project. By using the term fan-made episode, as well as pushing so strongly for show-accurate visual and audio styles, everyone, myself included, was expecting to have a 22-minute experience that was trying to be as close as possible to what we see on the Hub every Saturday. Of course, it only takes watching a few minutes of Double Rainboom to realize that this was never the goal of the project to begin with, and it's here that we begin to see how the project's tagline shot itself in the proverbial foot. A fan-made episode to most doesn't simply mean that it meets the length required for an episode of MLP. It means it's indistinguishable from the real thing. And since Double Rainboom obviously never intended to do this, it creates a false pretense that many viewers simply couldn't look past. Add in the aforementioned uncanny valley effect from a technical standpoint, and we're left with high expectations that were not only impossible to meet for a non-profit project, but, even worse, were never the goals of the project to begin with. Double Rainboom is a tribute and parody animation. A long one, but a parody nonetheless. It's not attempting to be a canon episode of MLP, but in an effort to keep the surprise second half under wraps, Zack never really revealed their true intentions for the tone of this project, and thus allowed themselves to present a work that looked like it had one goal in mind, but really had another. To a lot of fans, this total shift was a deal breaker, regardless if the product itself had any sort of intrinsic merit.
This whole scenario reminds me a lot of the lead-in to the now extremely popular anime series Mahou Shoujo Madoka Magica. Leading up to its release, Madoka was billed as a lighthearted magical girl show. The studio and director behind it were known for their often eccentric styles and had done shows running the gamut from comedy to gothic horror. The writer, Urobuchi Gen, however, had exclusively worked on uber-dark horror stories. Leading up to the release of Madoka, Butch Gen put out a statement that he was trying to move in a new direction with Madoka and do something lighthearted for once. When the show came out, it was obvious that it was a bit more disturbing than your average magical girl fare, but this was just attributed to the usual eccentricity of Studio Shaft. Only after a huge, shocking moment in the third episode did it turn out that all the marketing had been a deliberate lie to give a false sense of security. Once the episode aired, Butch again revealed that he'd been holding on to this secret for months, and viewers like myself who weren't prepared were blown away. That said, in the case of Madoka, the show was so under the radar before its release, and the twist was so mind-blowing and the show was so good, that it was received positively. As for Double Rainboom,
it does have intrinsic merit, and that's something that can't be ignored. This is a nearly 30-minute animation done as a labor of love by the community that's incredibly complex on a technical level. Add to the fact that it's a massive multinational collaboration organized entirely online, and we have something impressive just for the sake of what it is. Yes, Double Rainboom isn't a legit MLP episode, but as soon as you can move past that and ask yourself, okay, so what is here? There's actually a lot to love. Despite it being done a bit differently, just look at the animation on display here. It's reaching an incredibly strong high and doesn't waver from that bar throughout its runtime. This is a beautiful piece of work, especially when we see more of the Candlelight Wedding style animation as Twilight predicts what her talent enhancer's effect will be on her friends. The fandom references in the first half are out of place for a legitimate episode of Ponies, but these same gags would have been lauded in any other fan animation, and having them here doesn't make the ideas themselves any worse. The animation gets even more insane in the second half when Dash goes to Townsville, as we not only get to see Rainbow Dash in a whole new visual language, but we also get to see what Powerpuff might have looked like if done with today's technology. This fact alone is pretty amazing for fans of Powerpuff like myself, and it's kind of funny that an MLP animation is now probably also the most technically impressive Powerpuff Girls fan project as well. Add in the fact that we got to see the effectiveness of a weaponized Sonic Rainboom and more Pinkie Pie fourth wall shenanigans, all adds up to an amazing amount of awesome bits sprinkled throughout the runtime that makes this project memorable. The fact of the matter is, looking at this project not as an episode of MLP, but rather as something like epic wub time on steroids shows just how much of a massive achievement this is, and not the dismal failure so many seem to be ready to call it out for being. My only real complaint is that, despite showing all the big names from Cartoon Fridays, the only ones we really get to see are Powerpuff Girls and Fosters, making the whole thing feel a bit like more at this point unnecessary Faust worshipping. But if there is one way to finally put the idolization to bed and send it off with a tribute for the ages, I can't think of a better way to do so than Double Rainboom.
Thanks, Brony Curious. Those are great points altogether. Personally, I didn't get that much invested in Double Rainboom. I totally appreciate what it is and how much it does, but in terms of appealing to me on a personal level, I just didn't care all that much. If you want to see an animation that came out the other day that I did enjoy a lot, watch Once Upon a Time in Canterlot by Kanashi Panda. And while you're going around looking at pony videos, you should head over to Brony Curious's channel and show him some love as well. He did write half of this video after all, so if you enjoyed it, give him a subscribe or something. This has been part 1 of me giving in to the demands of my viewers. Next week, Boastbusters.
Bright skies, don't let the worries